Hello, everybody. This is Patrick Heffernan at TBR, and we're going to start the webinar in just about a minute as everybody else starts gathering in. So hold tight 1 second. We'll be right back. Okay, everyone, thanks for joining. This is Patrick Heffernan again, and welcome to the TBR webinar series. And before we get started, just a couple housekeeping notes. The bottom of the screen, if you haven't been on one of these webinars before, there's a series of buttons. You can access the slides, the audio control, the Q&A, and all that. And after the webinar, you're going to get an email that gives you a replay link and an opportunity to register for upcoming TBR webinars. And if you have any questions during this webinar, please put them in the Q&A widget. We will get to them as soon as we can at the end. And you can also reach out to all of us after the event. I'm showing you our email addresses and who we're going to be talking to now. So with that, thank you very much for joining us. And I want to just make sure right from the start that everyone knows what we're going to cover today, and also what we think is sort of the most important elements here, the top three things. And it's pretty straightforward. Look, talent is everything. In consulting and IT services, even in just technology broadly, people are what drive the results, and if you don't have the right people, then you're not going to get the right results. A second really critical thing to understand, and we're going to dive in, these may seem kind of obvious, we're going to dive into some of the nuance and the implication of these, but I just want to make sure that you see what we're talking about right at the start. Another important part is around partnering and how much that's changing. It's that ecosystem, the consulting and IT services and cloud and all that whole ecosystem is being driven, the change there is being driven in part by the tech vendors, but it's also by the consultancies and how they are now delivering value. And then the last thing we'll touch on is the centers themselves, what we're talking about, these innovation and transformation centers. They have had a positive viral impact. I actually used to talk about the way they infected the firms in a positive way, but I'm trying not to use that phrasing anymore, but they've had a positive viral impact on the firms themselves, and we think that's going to happen. It's going to happen again. So before we go too much further, and I say innovation and transformation centers too many more times, what is it exactly that we're talking about? What are these innovation centers? You can see our sort of definition right there that comes out of our market landscape. Are they delivery centers? Maybe to some degree. Are they showrooms? Are they places that clients can just play with new emerging technologies? Yes, to some degree. Are they where clients bring in their hardest business challenges and their aspirations, where they want to go? Yeah, mostly. That's really been one of the most important driving forces behind these. We've been to a variety of these. The ones that are circled are the ones that we have actually physically been to over the last few years, and we've spoken to people at every other one of those that's on this list. And so we've had the experience of being able to get into these centers and see what they're like. On the left, you can see what comes also out of our market landscape, and that's I hesitate to use the word metrics because they're not sort of fixed, they're not numerical, there's not a ton of data behind it, but those are the ways that we measure, that we evaluate the different components or elements that go into these centers and what makes them work, and how they've been successful for a lot of the vendors that you see on those lists right there. So this is exactly what we're going to cover today. What the best prepared consultancies did when everybody had to shift to the all virtual, how quickly they're going to evolve, how expectations have changed. It sometimes is hard to think back to what clients expected or what things were like pre-pandemic, but there were changes that were happening already, and new things that we think are going to emerge in 2021. And then we're going to talk about what these centers themselves mean in terms of the shift to what we call hybrid consulting. Before we do that, though, before we get into the meat of it, let's do a quick poll question. Do you anticipate traveling to one of these centers for an in-person session in 2021? So yes, definitely yes after June. hopefully but not certain, and no. Oh, and then type here the 256 character limit. So you can choose the last one if you want. That shows you that I built this poll right before we started the session. And I will say, personally, having been to so many of these in person and having recently done a virtual tour of PwC's Experience Center in Dubai, as much as I enjoyed the personal or the virtual tour, it's 100% not the same. And I really have enjoyed the time that we've been able to spend on the ground at these centers, in part because it's an opportunity to talk to both the people who are leading the centers and the people who are delivering, who are on site, the professionals that are actually working with clients about really what makes them work. So we'll get to the answers to that poll question in a little bit, but let's start with, what makes these centers so valuable to vendors and to clients. And we'll focus on the clients part of it first. And what we've learned over the years is how being on location at one of these centers is just a huge advantage. It allows clients, these are two massive quotes from clients that we've spoken to recently, but over the years we've spoken to a lot of clients who understood that getting themselves out of their own office and into a different headspace allows them to think creatively about all the possibilities, the art of the possible, all that. That's one of the biggest advantages that these off-site dedicated centers create. So the challenge in a hybrid engagement that we're in now is recreating that kind of creativity in that kind of experience when not everyone who is in the engagement is in the physical workspace itself. At least one of the consultancies we've spoken to recently said that unless 50% of the participants from the client are on location, then they're opting to do the entire session virtually. So that is, they need more than half of the client team to show up on site in order to get at least half of them into that necessary kind of creative headspace. And that strikes me as a really useful kind of rule of thumb right now, but it's not really based on any best practice or any kind of deep or long experience in delivering in these hybrid engagements. So I think over the next 6 to 9 to 12 months, what we're going to see is more and more of the consultancies are going to figure out exactly what's the right ratio for people in the building at the centers and how many people are remote. It's going to vary widely, of course it always does, based on the type of engagement and the type of client, but the 50% rule is probably a good starting point. And I want to make this point one more time because I think it's so incredibly important. The reason why a lot of the IT services vendors and consultancies invested large sums of money in building standalone centers and these incredibly well-kitted out places that people wanted to be at was because it allowed the client to be off-site, away from their laptop, away from their emails and the distractions of being in their office, and it really allowed people to open up and be more creative. I'm not the only one on this call, nor the only one that's been to these centers, so I want to turn to Boz, maybe a little extra perspective on what we've seen and what we're hearing from the clients.
Thank you, Patrick. So, I mean, as you said, I mean, clients, the experiences have varied, and I think the experiences will evolve as well as vendors are trying to establish the new hybrid delivery model and refine those ratios where they are. And we have pointed out here on the quotes kind of a couple of highlights that we have heard, and in the past as well. In many ways, the experience for the CTO, the CAO, the C-suite buyers. If there's no specific agenda, if there's no very pointed discussion, it feels more like, hey, it's a nice to know, good to hear about this solution exists, but 9 out of 10 times, those executives have to go back to their working environment, and that has been a challenge. At the same time, on the contrary, some buyers have shared with us that it has been very successful experience when it comes to them, like the buyers, launching a new initiative from scratch. Take, for example, like an RPA on AI, kind of a new kind of a solution. Automation is something that something they're trying to launch within the organization, trying to get that internal buy-in. So those centers have really helped the buyers, really get it, kind of connected to the existing environment, and really think strategically, get into the right mindset, and really help them to be the kind of the ambassadors and the advocates within their own organization as well. So again, it all depends on who the buyer is, I guess, and it all depends on the mindset, and really about vendors are the ones that have done their homework through pre-sales discussions and workshops have been more successful than others that have been just trying to open up the menu and say, what do you need, kind of thing. So as long as that discussion has a very pointed outcome, has certainly resonated better with the buyers. Patrick?
And then another thing before we get to the bottom on this slide in the chart that Sarah will have Boz explain that in a second, just want to emphasize that we have heard over the years, and I think it's an important thing to understand about who attends these sessions, that it's not just about getting the C-suite in. It's about getting participation from the right people at an enterprise, the right people at a client, and making sure, and we've heard this over and over again, that sort of the due diligence is done up front so that when the client shows up at site, they've actually worked out all their own internal politics, they've already worked out, what it is that they're trying to achieve. That's easier said than done, of course, and I think early on a lot of consultancies, a lot of IT services vendors spun their wheels a bit at their engagement sites, at their innovation and transformation centers, trying to make sure they had the right clients and trying to make sure that it was the people from those clients who were going to be able to get the most out of a session. But again, as we go into a hybrid kind of model and a hybrid engagement, that's going to be all the more true. Even if it's possible to bring in more people because you're bringing in half virtual and half in person, having the right people from the client on site, or having the right people from the client involved in the engagement and identifying them up front and understanding who it needs to be and what they're trying to achieve is really critical. So with that, Boz, maybe some other comments on what we have here about sort of the headcount aspect of this and the low cost opportunities.
Sure, yeah. I mean, and kind of real quick to orient the audience here on what that graph is and where it's coming from. It is from our global delivery benchmark, and that benchmark looks at distribution of resources, human resources across regions, across service lines, and what we call split into two main categories, offshore and onshore. And it's more for illustrative purposes here, for the purpose of the webinar, but it's also to kind of tie into the point that Patrick made a moment ago around what's that ratio going to look like in the future when it comes to the hybrid delivery and the hybrid engagement. Hybrid delivery, as we all know, has been around for a while, meaning a lot of the work that, consultants capture on site gets shipped overseas, and that remote delivery has been executed and supported for the last 2-3 decades, largely by IT services organizations that really made a living out of the whole outsourcing model, right? What we have here on the portraying is the percentage of headcount that we estimate of those 14 vendors that we have outlined and where they are in terms of what's the percentage of the offshore workforce, right? And how it correlates to the operating margin. And you can see is the scale, the size, the direction varies. But the bottom line is what we have seen overall is that the onshore to offshore delivery model when it comes to delivery has been in the range of about 40, it's about 60 to 80% for the most of the vendors are, having their workforce offshore, largely to enable a better price points and to deliver services at scale and kind of like a continuous services. As we think about the consulting organizations, is the way they think about developing those ratios. What are those thresholds? Is it still 20% on site and shift to 80% of the work offshore? Do they need to be a little bit more, grounded in the on-site work, even though it might be virtual, but at least in the same time zone? So those are some of the questions we're trying to get a feel for how the consultants are thinking about into 2021 and beyond. What we have identified as maybe a potential challenge is that if consultancies start to shift too much of the really consulting and high-touch advisory work offshore, we think that there's a threat to them to lose some of the knowledge share, some of the relationships that they have built for a while, especially if they're trying to rebuild their workforce and trying to maintain that consulting kind of a breadth and expertise that they're known for, especially with new upcoming consultants going through the ranks before becoming a partner. So the ratio, I think, will be very critical. And I actually looked up, this is the overall onshore to offshore split to operating margin for all those vendors that we have outlined. a vendor that it's kind of a cutting across, like from IT services to consulting, like Accenture. I looked at their actual consulting and systems integration kind of a ratio. And while we have here on the slide that about 60% of the overall workforce is offshore, and 40, and how it correlates to the operating margin, for the consulting and systems integration is actually the opposite. About 40% of their workforce is offshore and 60% is still on site, which helps them to drive that engine, and really to drive those discussions and making sure that they capture enough of front end kind of bookings from a consulting-led bookings that can still enable them to provide support in the back end. So if 40-60 is a good for delivery, perhaps maybe 60-40 is good for consulting, but that's just kind of an example. I just want to highlight and kind of start to think about where do we see those ratios evolve as we move towards hybrid-based engagement, not just hybrid-based delivery. Without turning back over to Patrick.
Excellent, thanks. And it's a good reminder, if you're not too familiar with TBR, we are very much vendor-centric. I mean, we lead our research by looking at what the individual vendors do and build up our understanding of the market through that. So that's a good reminder of that. And speaking of the vendors, let's talk about what value did the vendors get from these centers? What's traditionally been what has driven the investments and driven the value on the vendor side? And very simply, it's been sort of an ability to show off that full range of capabilities and services, strengthen relationships, open the potential for expanding footprint. I mean, the easiest way to think about it is the opportunity to show that any one of these consultancies does a lot more than just the one thing that they've been brought into the client for. So that you bring them to a center, you show them all the stuff that you can do. The second and also incredibly important aspect of these centers has been the value in attracting talent and in retaining talent and in training talent. And then, as I mentioned at the very beginning, sort of the viral impact of changing the business model and even developing IP. So if that's what these centers were all about pre-pandemic, what happens to that value when the engagements change from being on site to being hybrid? So we heard from multiple IT service vendors and consultancies early on talking about how engagements continued without any major disruptions during the pandemic and with everybody being remote. But what we haven't really heard, and let me make sure that's real clear. So we heard from most of the folks that we spoke with that very little disruption, things went fine with everybody going remote. What we haven't really heard, though, is that those extensions of the engagements, those expansions, those conversations of, hey, can you help with this too? Those kinds of engagements, we're not sure that those have continued at the same pace as before. And I mean, it makes sense because the best engagements were those blends of getting deep into the weeds of solving a specific problem, and then also being able to step back far enough to sort of see the big picture and see what the implications were and understand what would happen when a pilot project went to scale or MVP went to scale. So in person, that's easy to orchestrate or easier to orchestrate. So one of the challenges that all the vendors, all the consultancies have been tackling is creating that flow and that blend in a remote environment. And beginning to anticipate, okay, what is that going to look like when we get fully into a hybrid future, which is essentially now, but in the very near term. So I think the hybrid engagements are probably going to make it a little tougher, at least initially, to expand footprint. Again, it's sort of doing it organically as part of the normal engagement. I think by the end of 2021, these hybrid engagements are probably going to actually accelerate that expansion of footprint as the centers themselves get much better at pulling in subject matter experts from all over the world, at doing demonstrations that are both in person and virtual at the same time, finding ways to bring creative thinkers and industry experts seamlessly into a hybrid kind of engagement. I think the physical location, of course, is still going to be very important, and the experience and the practice and the comfortableness that we all have now with being virtual is only going to enhance those engagements and make the value that much more appealing. So that's the expanding the footprint and doing more for your client side of it. On the talent side of it, one thing that we've observed over the years is that the vendors who invest the most in staffing these centers and There's a leadership angle here, too, that I could go off on. We'll save that for another webinar. But the vendors that have invested in staffing so that those innovation and transformation centers are not only well-staffed, but they become internal magnets. People want to work in these places. They want to bring in the clients with the toughest problem. They want to work with the coolest new technology, and contribute to a greater collaboration across the entire firm. That sort of dramatically improves the entire employee experience. And employee experience, as we learned at the beginning of the pandemic, went from being an important thing to one of the most important things. Boz, before I wrap on this, a couple more thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to kind of give a quick example here of a company, of a firm that, like KPMG, that employee experience, certainly, as you said, it has elevated in importance across many organizations. But when it comes to those centers for KPMG, we looked at the firm and trying to kind of assess where they are on that spectrum in terms of investments and catching up to its big four peers as well as IT services organizations. And they have certainly put, quite a bit of money, whatever the amount is in terms of investments. A couple of years ago, they launched like a large $5 billion over 5 years kind of initiative, not just for the centers, but including in those centers technology, people, kind of experiences. But with the focus on really trying to attract the right talent and trying to staff those, what they call ignition center. That's the kind of the equivalent of those innovation facilities that everyone has a different name. Creating an environment that resembles of a tech company. It's kind of part of that long-term, focus on building a technology acumen, just like everybody else is trying to build more tech savvy and whatnot. What KPMG, what we have heard has been struggling and starting to overcome. It's getting better, but at least initially, was something that the legacy partners, especially the audit partners, the tax partners, who have put couple of decades behind them, and then they're looking towards retirement, for example, they were not as easy to convince those centers are the right investment to do. So I don't think that challenge was unique to KPMG, but certainly something that I think Big Four have had more challenge to overcome, especially as they have all these different member firms and the way the operations are set up. But KPMG, has had a little bit like a double challenge to kind of catch up, not just in the overall technology space, but also some of the internal battles as they're trying to build that momentum in the space. So very much their focus has been on really creating of a tech startup kind of a facility, investing even in kind of a separate location facilities to try to really think about, how to appeal to the type of talent that's the right talent that can support those engagements. Not just on a one-off project, but really be part of a bigger, broader framework.
Thanks. And just to sort of, just kind of put a bow on all this. I mean, the question, what did the best prepared consultancies do to shift here? There are a few vendors that really do stand out, and Boz mentioned KPMG. I would say EY stands out as well. They had been delivering hybrid engagements through what they call their wave spaces prior to the pandemic. So they had tested that capability, and they had begun learning what did and did not work before they actually were forced to go into all remote. And a few of the other vendors recognized pretty quickly that people that are adept at delivering in-person, deeply engaging and creative workshops are not necessarily adept at delivering the same thing remotely. I think all of us probably have some experience now with our kids that are, the elementary school teachers trying to teach via Zoom, and it's not an easy shift. So the vendors that sort of recognized that and invested very quickly in training and identifying who had and who didn't have the right skills for remote workshops, that was really critical. So, I mean, in our view, those two factors, the established experience around a hybrid delivery and then immediate investment in training for remote delivery. Those were the differences early on, and I think will continue to be the differences as everyone begins to move more quickly into this hybrid engagement, this hybrid consulting model. And in addition, I tend to think of this as really an extension of that point around talent and staffing and leadership, all those elements of the centers. The vendors, the IT services vendors and the consultancies who had a skeleton staff at these centers or who just flew people in for engagements and didn't keep people on site. I think they're going to be challenged, much more challenged, to be able to make changes to hybrid. And in some cases, it really is that simple. Having the right people on the ground and having those people trained and ready to go makes all the difference. So with that, let's pivot to clients and pivot back to clients and talk about some of the expectations, what was true before the pandemic and what's changed, what's coming next. And before we go to the IT services and the digital perspective on it, let's start with Allan Krans, who leads our cloud and software practice, and he can talk about it from the cloud and software angle. Allan?
Great. So this will provide some of the context for, whatever strategy is going to be used with innovation centers, what customers are going to be working through, and what will be their objective in terms of engaging with some of the service vendors around innovation and business model change. And obviously, COVID is going to play a big role. So this comes from our study that's going to publish in the next week that collects feedback from cloud IT decision makers in terms of what they're using, who they're working with, what the value is that they're deriving from increased cloud adoption. And so these are long-term impacts of the COVID-19 on their IT strategy. A lot of it is going to be a continuation of what we are seeing right now, right? So if you look at some of the most noted was remote work. Makes sense, accelerated cloud adoption. So the benefits of having a distributed access for applications and productivity tools is something that is going to continue into the future, even as some of the effects of the pandemic wane. Two of the more interesting things is if you look at the bottom of the graph, really very few organizations expect to just return to what they were doing before 2020. So, for the most part, there's we keep hearing about the increased demand and pervasiveness of transformation in business process and IT, and that really almost every organization has been forced to adjust their model, either for survival or to seek out pockets of growth. And so there's been, instead of a subset of organizations in any industry going through transformation at one time, it's really been everybody. And so part of the challenge from customers actually is getting access to the best resources, the best consultants to help them work through these, because there is just so much demand for people to help guide these business and IT changes that are expected to continue, even after the pandemic wanes. And then lastly, the good news for, I think, folks in the technology industry and the services organizations is 35% of respondents expected to actually increase their IT budgets long term. And so technology, I think, has been proven as a critical part of business and operations and all of those strategies that drive their business model. And so that's not going to go away for a pretty significant portion of organizations out there. So there will be more funds to invest in technology initiatives and transformation initiatives, which will, again, in whatever model it occurs, drive demand for engagement with SIs and innovation center projects. Okay,
excellent.
So that's some context from the customer side. Yeah, back to you, Patrick.
Thanks, Allan. That sets it up perfectly, because now we can talk about the research we've done over the last few years and leading into the beginning of 2021, that sort of changes around client expectations. Clients have wanted their own current technology partners, especially from the cloud services side, in the room during these workshops. This has been an evolving issue for years. We've heard about it from all three sides, that was increasingly a priority, that if you're at PwC's Experience Center and you run SAP back at home, you want SAP there during your 2-day workshop. Clients have become more interested in leaving somebody behind. So by that I mean, you do a 2-day workshop, and then a squad from the client stays on for 1 to 3 weeks, gets their hands dirty, do the MVPs, all the rest. There are implications for that on the consulting business model, and I'll get to that a little bit later. And I think it's critical to understand this is a trend that's been developing for a few years. It has been becoming a lot more pronounced. Well, at the start of 2020, I should say, it was becoming more pronounced. Obviously, it had to be put on hold for a bit. And then a third one, clients just wanted their own innovation and transformation centers stood up in their own environment. That's an idea that's been bubbling along for a while. Some vendors, Capgemini stands out, aggressively taking this approach and having a lot of success with it. And a few vendors have been able to make it more appealing for the clients to actually build these kind of centers. Again, oftentimes with many of the same characteristics, being separate from the main facilities, being a standalone center, having dedicated staff, all those kind of things, but setting up an innovation and transformation center in their own environment. So to get back to partners for a minute, we've talked a lot about the challenge with respect to having technology partners present in the workshops and in the engagements. And there's a difficulty of sort of folding in a client's legacy IT environment into a discussion about emerging technologies and the possibilities of the future. And so hybrid puts a little bit of a twist on that, and kind of a positive one, actually. So if some of the people from the client participating in a 2-day workshop are actually still in their own environment, they're in their own physical setting, their own IT environment, their own office, then there's less question about whether or not emerging technologies or some new novel solutions are actually going to fit, because the people who are on the ground evaluating it and thinking about it and living with it are in their own environments right now, even as their colleagues are hearing and thinking and experiencing what's possible and what's new. So I think in the past, if consultancies were reluctant to have technology partners on site at these experience centers because it might dilute the consulting brand, then having them remote and engaging in these hybrid engagements by being a remote participant is sort of the perfect way to overcome that reluctance around brand. And at the same time, it addresses the challenge of the client's actual legacy at the moment, what they got, what they're running current IT ecosystem. So weirdly, I think the hybrid engagement model may actually help fuel change across the ecosystem and accelerate some of the partnerships that we've seen. And again, make it easier for a PwC or an EY or Capgemini to invite an SAP, an Oracle, a Google, AWS, Microsoft into an engagement without making it seem like they are prejudicing, they're influencing, I can't say that word, influencing the client towards any particular technology or technology vendor. And Kelly Lesiczka, who's on our team and has been to these centers and covers, is our lead analyst for EY and HCL and McKinsey. Some thoughts, Kelly, from you?
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. I wanted to call out BCG in this case because I think they are a good example of blending the technology and their technology experts into these centers. When they were approaching a lot of their transformation engagements, a lot of the partners and advisory staff were struggling to properly showcase the capabilities of technologies around data analytics, digital. They were struggling to really showcase the value and what they could actually do. So they had a bit of a block trying to get the center, able to integrate some of these subsidiary technologies into their engagements. They were having issues really showcasing that and bringing it in, and bringing the staff together within the centers to ensure that they could actually be together. They could show, they would have the technology component as well as the advisory component. It did help, but the advisory staff still didn't quite grasp how to properly communicate some of these capabilities. So they started using some training programs to really show what type of technical capabilities they actually had and how they could properly message. And that really helped to show the clients what it was possible. And I think going back to Patrick's point about the value of the technology components within these experience centers, it really helped them to bring together the two and educate around what was actually possible. There were two different mindsets, and I think they just kind of struggled at first to really tie them together. But bringing the staff into the center was step one, and then following up with some training to really show them what they could do was really helpful to the company in building out their transformation. But back to you, Patrick.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelly. And so now let's talk about some radical trends, some crazy ideas. With not a very pretty slide, you all are now realizing the limits of my PowerPoint capabilities. So I mentioned the leave behinds, this idea of having the client put their own staff into a center for a 3-week secondment or even longer. What's funny about that is the hybrid model, the hybrid consulting model, the hybrid engagement model is sort of ideal for this. It's going to make it even more appealing. Here's one of the reasons why. We have been discussing the challenge in this pandemic of truly being able to understand a client's needs and fears and challenges and rhythms, all that stuff that you get when you're on site with a client, when a consultant is at the client site. So for some of the consultancies, maybe bringing the client on site will allow the consultancy to get after that problem, allows that kind of sustained in-person interaction. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how many of these centers are reconfigured and repurposed and set up to allow for more clients on site for longer periods of time beyond just the 2-day engagement. We know this has been done in the past by some of the consultancies, and one of the advantages they found in it was the opportunity for clients, clients of the consultancy, but from different companies clearly, and even different industries, being able to bump into each other and bounce ideas off each other. So it kind of creates a certain kind of environment that's ideal for that creativity, for that finding out what's possible, what can be done. I think the client's desire to have their own innovation and transformation centers stood up on location. Again, I think here the tide is going to start flowing really in the other direction as the hybrid engagement model addresses some of the advantages of building that bespoke kind of client-owned center. That allows the consulting team to drop into what would be a familiar to them environment, work in that kind of workshop experience that they're best at, but at the client center using the client technology. So I think we're going to start swinging in that direction again and again. Capgemini has been doing it for a little bit. I think they're a good model of what works in the consulting side. So then the final kind of crazy idea is putting the center, putting the innovation and transformation center where the industry is. So if you had an innovation and transformation center that was dedicated to the transportation and hospitality industries, then located at an airport terminal, or have a healthcare-centric center, innovation and transformation center located inside a hospital. McKinsey kind of flirted with this idea a little bit with their center in the Mall of America. I think we're going to see more examples of this in 2021 and more of a long-term investment into a center that's truly dedicated to a particular industry. To jump back for a minute here, when these centers first started to blossom, that was one of the big questions was, do you create a center that's dedicated to a particular industry, or do you make it a center for all industries? And some consultancies really were led by the client, the local client. So if they were in Frankfurt, Germany, or they were New York City, it was financial services clients. A lot of consultancies and IT services vendors moved away from that because they wanted to be able to use the centers across all kinds of industries, and they saw the opportunity to bring people into these creative spaces. I think there's going to be a move back in the other direction where the opportunity to have a dedicated to a particular industry center, and even better, have it in the environment where, I mean, you can imagine if you were a transportation or a hospitality client, or you were in that industry, and you went to an innovation and transformation center that was literally in a airport terminal, just seeing and feeling and knowing everything that's happening there would just simply make it resonate all that much more. So that's my crazy wild idea for 2021, which I really hope does come true. So with that, let's see the poll results. And thank you for no one answering that fifth answer there. Looks like hopefully but not certain. So there's a lot of there's actually not as many no's as I would have expected. So a lot of people looking forward to going off to these centers sometime in 2021. And you know what, Kelly, I'm sorry. I realized I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about some of those radical ideas. Did you have some other thoughts you wanted to throw in?
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you. I just have a few quick examples I want to call out here. Going beyond a little bit what Patrick had said, I think some of the changes with some of these centers has really opened the door for some vendors, and they've taken the opportunity to really open centers in places that they hadn't necessarily thought they would before, or it really pushed them to open where they thought about it, but they never actually did anything about it at the time. So I think EY is an example I want to call out. With an industry-centric approach as well, they had opened a manufacturing center in Ohio, and it was in collaboration with a partner, but they're still using this opportunity to kind of shift the way that they had approached experience and their wave space experience a little bit, to bring in the partner, to bring in some of the more development and design expertise, but also designing it with the hybrid approach in mind. So I think that's kind of a good example of how things are kind of shifting to help their clients still co-develop with them, but just in a different way and looking at it differently. One other example I wanted to call out was HCL. I think it was about a week ago. They announced how they were entering the Vietnam market. So they were opening a delivery center there, which was focusing on ICT and engineering institutions. And a big part of the push in this area was to develop their talent and kind of scale in that area. So building up the scale and the breadth of the technologies that they need in that area. So I think we're going to see a bit more of these pushes to open in new centers and really bring their technology while also scaling up new talent. So using this opportunity to bring new talent into their centers and really broaden their footprint. So thank you. Back to you.
Thanks. Thank you, Kelly, and I apologize that I forgot to mention that. So let's shift now. The last sort of big third point we're going to get to is why are these things a shift towards hybrid consulting? But before we can get to hybrid consulting, we need to look at the bigger picture around IT right now, and that's hybrid environments overall. So with that, back to Allan Krans for the cloud and software perspective. Allan?
Great. Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, so I think the other hybrid, if you will, is the adoption strategy for cloud within organizations. And, you know, what we've seen is clearly cloud is a bigger part of almost every customer we speak with. It's not uncommon to hear when we ask about what proportion of their IT budget goes to cloud, it's approaching 50% for a lot of organizations, and they continue to expect that to grow. But there is, you know, always that remaining portion of the environment that, you know, whether it's 15 or 30%, that isn't worth moving, is working where it is, and they don't plan for that to be part of their near-term transformation strategy. So, you know, that's probably 5+ years out for a lot of that stuff, and in the end, a lot of things may remain on-premise. So working with those existing assets is really important. They don't want to slow down innovation just because things aren't all cloud delivered, and that's what makes hybrid IT, which is mixing that traditional environment along with new cloud services, really the dominant objective for most organizations, and that's remained steady probably over the last 2 years. The other thing that we've seen is a lot of customers that have gained experience with one cloud or kind of a small set of cloud vendors and services look to broaden that over time as they get more maturity in terms of their usage and needs change, that type of thing. So if we look at the change just from throughout the course of 2020, so if customers are going to be all cloud, perhaps they're smaller and just more aggressive in terms of standardizing on cloud versus the traditional legacy that most organizations have. Even if they're doing that, they're looking more at a hybrid cloud environment, which gives them options in terms of having multiple platforms, but that overall ability to manage across and really utilize data is a big focus for a lot of those hybrid engagements. So they can get better information, make better decisions, and it's more difficult to do that if you're operating in silos for different workloads. And so I think to bring it back to the engagement center, you know, what that means for these engagement centers, Patrick's talked about the difficulty of getting even a single technology vendor to be part of these engagements. It's even more difficult when you're talking across multiple providers. And so for hybrid engagements like that and solutions that are going to be hybrid, that mixture of delivery methods where you can get all the right technology vendors to come in for just the right period of time and not change the overall engagement with the client, that's really ideal and part of how it ties back to the hybrid innovation center strategy going forward. Patrick, back to you.
Excellent, thanks. So one more point that we want, well, two more points that we want to make, but one more big slide here before we wrap up and take some Q&A. This is something I mentioned at the beginning and I think is really important to understand. And again, we're coming at it from the perspective of, for the last 4 or 5 years, having visited a lot of these centers and understood what's happening not only on site, but also what's happening across the firms that these centers have been built in. So one of the most really meaningful impacts for the consultancies and the IT services vendors who have made the most of these centers, who have invested in them the most, has been to change the business model and the culture and the way that those vendors position themselves in the market. So a business model shift to include selling software, not just selling consulting. And I think we're all familiar with PwC products. PwC products didn't come directly because of their experience centers, but the experience centers predated it and sort of set the stage for what became PwC products. Cultural shifts have been made easier, sometimes mandated, cross-collaboration throughout the company. We've been at multiple times. We've been at centers, whether they're wave spaces or applied innovation exchanges or whatever, and they bring in folks from a different part of either a different part of the firm, a different part of the practice, somebody outside of the normal confines of consulting, which makes just a huge difference. And then it really has been, these centers have been a way to change the market position, change the market perception. It's critical to how the more successful vendors have been able to expand their footprint within existing clients and change the way clients think about them and their capabilities. So if all that happened pre-pandemic, what's going to happen when it shifts to hybrid engagements and to hybrid consulting? And I keep saying hybrid consulting, and that I mean engagements that are intended to be delivered in a blend of virtual and on-site and a true blend of consulting and technology, a true blend of the consulting business model and the software and platforms and cloud and that business model. And so the vendors who develop their best practices around these hybrid engagements at the centers and are then able to share those practices globally and implement them smartly, those are really the vendors who we think are gonna outpace their peers and be able to deliver in what is going to be a hybrid consulting world in the future. That is clearly where things are headed, we think. And I think the vendors who have had the most success in using their centers to positively change their own culture, their own business model, and their own perception in the market are the ones that are going to do the best in that hybrid setting. I want to give Kelly and Boz a chance to weigh in too, because again, they've been to a number of these centers, and because of their roles leading our research on some of the key vendors here, let's have Kelly. Kelly, would you go first and then Boz?
Yeah, sure. So some of the trends that I've seen with some of these vendors is they've really tried to, some of the challenges that they've seen has really been trying to replicate that same experience. And I think shifting the way, as I had explained a little bit before, with EY creating a center with a hybrid mindset while they were designing, I think we're going to see a lot more of that as they try to replicate that same experience. It's much more difficult to get the same interaction with clients. It's not quite the same as walking into a room and seeing a person. A lot of it's virtual. So I think trying to engage with them more virtually and really trying to get the same reaction, the same experience for the clients will make a big difference in trying to really change the way that they do digital transformation, especially as they're looking to shift to navigate now, as well as trying to see how they can predict some of these more abrupt and dramatic shifts in the market, whereas the pandemic was not necessarily foreseen, so vendors weren't really prepared and they weren't built to respond to it. But a lot of the shifts that they're making in these hybrid centers and in these engagements, it's really changing to see how they can prepare to really change and make sure that they can respond more quickly and that they'll be able to fill any gaps that they see. To you, Boz.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. I mean, I'm just going back to what Patrick mentioned earlier about culture and changing how important culture is in terms of embracing and embedding those centers into the delivery frameworks and the engagement frameworks. One vendor that comes to mind that I cover for a few years now here in TBR is Accenture, and thinking about how a company like Fjord that they acquired way back when, probably 6-7 years ago, has really been serving as a catalyst of how Accenture does and utilizes those centers and how it had permeated beyond just design thinking and design type of studios that Fjord brought into innovation studio, that the Fjord framework brought into the Accenture. It has expanded way beyond that. It has gone into application services and liquid studios and getting innovation hubs, all sorts of different facilities with different names. And Accenture has really kind of expanded the network of those facilities and trying to be a little bit more, just like in a very typical Accenture style, serving all clients in all fashions, and has expanded the breadth and the depth. But I think the culture that Fjord brought in was a very key element at the right time to start influencing and it really infecting Accenture's thinking around innovation in those centers. And I think that's kind of what we start to see from a company like Accenture, the next wave of those centers and how they start thinking about how do they engage with clients and when do they bring partners. We had highlighted a couple of examples in the earlier slide where some of those studios and some of those innovation hubs around the world, Accenture already has partners on site. It has dedicated space for partners, so that's certainly something they already invested pre-pandemic. But we'll start in some facilities, they're starting to dedicate on specific industry verticals like manufacturing here in the U.S. and in Germany, starting to push what they call Industry X, really very much into kind of industrial manufacturing, industrials overall as a vertical. So they're developing those centers in that regards, but again, trying to stay ahead of the market. And the latest one that we actually saw from Accenture just a couple weeks ago, they call it Extract. It's an actual physical facility that they launched in Chicago. And that facility, it's kind of a multi-purpose where it has that sort of a corporate social responsibility angle through, how do we solve the world's food challenges, but it also is enabled by 3 dimensions within Accenture, one being the technology, obviously, being the vertical aspects, and really third kind of the line of business kind of thinking from Accenture. So they have a combination of skills and thinking that are pushed through that particular setting. Having what they call different zones or different types of discussions with their clients, focused on future of living, future of buying, and future of growing. Obviously, all these are kind of focused either on the retail side, on the buying, future of growing on the agriculture side, and future of living overall, where things, how we all interact from an Internet of Things and kind of like connectivity standpoint. So each one of those areas are bringing kind of like pulling from different pieces of Accenture. And that particular facility, was supposed to open back in the spring, right before, the pandemic, like it was think of like early spring. So as the COVID hit, that got delayed. And the plan right now for this facility is to be in that hybrid setting we've been talking about, as the ideas, hopefully this spring or summer, businesses start to reopen and essentially can bring clients in. But they have started to develop the mindset of not just the hybrid in terms of engaging, but also hybrid in terms of bringing all the capabilities that they have with, again, a more purpose-driven kind of a facility. And as we go back to that culture element of like, okay, not just driving business for the business sake and execution, which is an important element, but there's also a little bit of a PR, but also of a new angle that actually enables them to, to think and obviously influence the organization, those innovation hubs network across the globe, to start to think differently and bringing those capabilities across. So again, a recent example, but kind of tagging back to, like I said, Fjord's influencing overall innovation thinking a few years back for Accenture. They are certainly one of the fewer firms that, if they do have scale and they do have the breadth of those facilities, and they are trying to reinvent themselves right now as we speak of how they engage and how they utilize those facilities they invested so heavily in the last few years, but obviously not jeopardizing any health protocols and things in that nature. And with that, I'll turn it over to Patrick to wrap up the call.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And I think it's funny you bring up Accenture, because Accenture was one of the last places that we got to go before the pandemic struck. So out in San Francisco. So where are you going to find all this research? Where are you going to find all the things we've been talking about? On the far left, you can see there's a special report. It's downloadable free off of our website. It walks through all of our thinking on these centers and the evolution of this idea of innovation and transformation centers, the various elements of how we evaluate them. It's a long narrative about innovation and transformation centers all the way up to the end of this year. And hold on, we jumped to another slide there. Let's go back to that. So in the middle is our market landscape, which takes the trends and looks at 14 specific vendors, what they're doing and why. Again, reinforcing this idea of that's where technology business research comes from, looking at the individual vendors. This is our paid research. It's going to be updated every 6 months. We're going to add vendors every time and update the analysis on the vendors that are covered. At the very beginning of this, you may recall the slide that included the red circles of the places we've been. That's the list of the vendors that are in this market landscape now, and what we're going to be adding in the spring. So again, April, May timeframe to see that. And then on the right, you can see this is what we're going to be doing. So one final thought before we turn to the Q&A. I mentioned leadership briefly. I think we've spoken at length with many people at these centers who have recognized the importance of training people to lead at the centers, using the centers as hubs for developing talent, including developing leadership talent. There's one other component that we've seen over the years that's always been important, but maybe even more so now with hybrid experiences and hybrid consulting. And these places have the greatest impact, I think, when there's an evangelist, someone who can sell all the benefits internally and externally, is a dynamic face for these centers. It's a leadership role. It's not a leadership role that every leader can take on. So when I think about the hybrid future and how face-to-face time is going to increase finally again after this long remote status, I think about how finding that person that is the face of these centers is really going to be critical to sustain success. So we have a couple extra slides here that show you the coverage across our IT services benchmark, also our digital transformation portfolio. But I'll bring this up. We do have a couple questions, so we'll take the time we got when we get them here. One question, will you get the slides? Yes, of course, we'll definitely send them. A question on PwC products. Can you clarify that again? Is that their innovation center? So no, PwC products is a new offering that they launched they launched it sometime just before the pandemic, I want to say in March, and it's taking all of the assets that they have been building and using with clients or using on engagements and productizing them. It's platforms, it's software, it's technology built specifically for their clients, but then turned around and sold as technology. So we don't think of PwC as being a software company. We think of them as being a consultancy and a tax and audit house. They are now a software company as well. They sell software, they sell platforms. PwC products is not a standalone. That's too much of an exaggeration, but it is a business group within PwC. It has its own revenue goals. It has its own leadership. It is truly a technology product software house within the larger PwC. And it's important, I think, to understand how everybody has been doing that. All of these vendors have been developing, all the big four vendors and the consultancies and Capgemini and Atos and the rest have all been developing software and platforms and have been selling them. But PwC is the first one that sort of made it again, I use standalone, I don't quite mean it that way, but has built its own practice around products and software and platforms. There's a special report that we wrote back in March on our website that you can grab and see that. And that's one other, the only other comment is and the only question here is good content and great. So we'll leave it there. I think we're just about out of time. Oh, hold on, there's another one that's come in. While the change to virtual had its challenges, to say the least, it's less than ideal, there's also an upside that globally best experts can be included in all of the client activity or collaboration in person. This aspect of virtual hybrid will be valuable to continue. So this idea that being able to touch and gather SMEs from around the world easier is something that every single consultancy we've spoken with in the last 6 months has talked about. It's a huge advantage. It's also, the flip side to that is it's also a huge burden. The most in-demand SMEs are no longer able to say, hey, I can't make it. They're pretty much on the clock 24/7 for the firms that they work for. So it is a great advantage to clients. It's something that all the vendors themselves, the consultancies and IT services vendors, need to figure out how to manage. It's a leadership challenge. It's a good one to have, but it's still a leadership challenge going forward. And with that, I appreciate everybody for being here. Alan and Kelly and Boz, thank you all very much. And that ends the session. Tune in next time. When is it? January 6th. The next webinar is COVID-19 changes everything. What's next for devices and IoT? You're going to get a survey when you log off. Thank you very much for being here, everybody. Thanks. Take care.